I'm John Shackle, and welcome to A Missionary Moment. This will be the first of a 6-part series exploring theology of the body based on a Bible study that I'm doing on campus with students. I hope you enjoy it. So we're going to dive right in. Today we're talking about Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21 through 33. And if you've been to a wedding recently, you might have heard this one. It's one of St. Paul's most famous passages. And I'm just going to read through it to start us off. So again, it's Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 through 33. Beloved, be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. As the church is subject to Christ, so let wives also be subject in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. Even so, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no man ever hates his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother, and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, and I mean in reference to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects his husband. Okay, so much to do here. We could spend 5 weeks on this alone. I'm going to try to do just a few minutes to unpack this. First of all, I want to ask the question of how do you think of God? How do you think of God's love? Some common themes that people think is, I think of God as a loving father, who created me out of love, and he loves me like a dad, like a good dad loves his kids. Others think of God's love as a shepherd, one who comes and guides his sheep, guiding him to himself. And there are many more images that go on here, but one that I want to focus on specifically here is perhaps the greatest of images and the most profound of images and realities of God's love, which is God's love as spouse, God's love as bridegroom coming to us. And that might sound a little bit weird, especially to the men out there, like, okay, I'm a guy, but I'm God's bride. It's a little bit strange, but flip with me, if you'd like, back to Isaiah chapter 54. This is a prevalent theme in the entire Old Covenant. Israel seen as the bride of God. The bride of God whom God is preparing, purifying throughout the covenants, from Adam to Noah to Abraham and so forth, preparing Israel to receive the bridegroom, the ultimate bridegroom, in the ultimate covenant. So let's look at this language from the Old Covenant. Isaiah chapter 54, verse 5. God, speaking through Isaiah, says to Israel, "For your maker, God, is your husband. The Lord of hosts is his name, and the Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer." God, your maker, is your husband. And just a little bit later in Isaiah, he says the same thing. God comes to you like a bridegroom, as your husband who takes a bride to himself. Now that's important. That's incredibly important for understanding this passage that St. Paul lays out before us. And I just want to walk through a couple key lines here. First of all, whenever this is read at a wedding or during the liturgical calendar, in this normal spot, you can always see people cringing in the seats a little bit, like, be subject to one another out of love for Christ. Wives, be subject to your husbands. And the husbands are kind of like, and then we get down to verse 5, and it says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. And the wives get to elbow their husbands right back, right? So there's always a little bit of back and forth with it. But I just want to focus on a simple theme here. The whole framework for St. Paul's passage here is be subject out of reverence for Christ. Any interpretation of this passage whether it be a newfangled a feminist perspective of, oh, this is an oppressive verse where St. Paul is saying, wives, you must be subject and below your husbands and obey him as your master. That's not the framework and proper hermeneutic at all to understand this verse. Rather, it is subjection to other out of reverence for Christ. Both ways. Both ways. A humble, pious, almost awe-filled trembling in the presence of another person whom God dwells in their soul by virtue of their baptism. That's what Paul is talking about here. It's one of profound servanthood. So verse 22, wives, be subject, or a different translation is be submissive to your husbands as to the Lord. What does it mean to be submissive to somebody? How would a wife be submissive to her husband? What is he getting at? Well, sub, under, missive, mission. This is a simple way perhaps you've heard before. To be submissive to your husband does not mean to cower in front of him as if he's your master, but rather allowing him to lead you on his mission. What is his mission? We find this mission, as we've already referenced, in verse 25 of Ephesians 5. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her. So what is the mission that the man is called to live out with his wife? What mission is the wife to submit herself to? It's the mission of the cross. If there was a cross in here, a crucifix, I'd point to that and I'd say, guys, that's your mission. That's how you love your wife. By pouring yourself out for her. By emptying yourself of selfish desires so that you start to take responsibility for her life. For whether or not she's feeling cherished and cared for. That's the mission, one of the primary missions in the vocation of marriage. And what woman doesn't want to get on board with that mission? So that's just the first point. The second point here is down in verse 31. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery. This is key. This is a great mystery, says St. Paul, and I mean it in reference to Christ and his church. What is St. Paul getting at here? That in the Old Covenant, God is seen, the Maker, God is seen ultimately as a husband, or soon-to-be husband, really, who is drawing Israel to himself, preparing God's people, the people of God, the Israelite people throughout the covenant to receive him, right? And I already referenced that. Christ comes as the bridegroom. Christ breaks into the world and comes down as the bridegroom. Now, this is key in the new covenant, which as Catholics we celebrate in most paramount fashion in the sacrament of the Eucharist, the Holy Mass, whereby the Lord comes down, the Son leaves his Father, the Son of God leaves his Father and comes down and is joined to his wife. Who is his wife? His bride, the church. Literally entering into his bride, you can see the marital and conjugal language here. It's beautiful. Enters into his bride, the church, coming down into the heart of the church, the altar, the marriage bed, which is classically seen as an altar. So sometimes if you go to a Catholic church, you'll see a canopy over the altar, thereby symbolizing the marital paradigm of the Mass, whereby, again, the Son leaves his Father and comes down every Mass to be joined to his wife, to be joined to his bride. And it gets even better. It doesn't stop there. He doesn't just come to the bride, the church, in an impersonal fashion, coming to everybody, but he does come to everybody. But then he also comes personally, where we, as Catholics, we go up to receive communion. We walk down the aisle as the bride, right? As you can see, I was just at a wedding this past weekend, and one of the most beautiful and powerful moments is when the doors burst open in the back, and the bride walks down, processes down the aisle to meet her soon-to-be bridegroom, the bridegroom, her spouse, who then takes her to himself. When we go up to receive communion, we are walking down the aisle to be received by and receive our bridegroom, Christ, who comes to us in the Holy Eucharist, fully present, and literally enters into us in receiving him. So a couple modest implications. Again, there's so much more that could be said here. First, that the Mass is a wedding feast. It's a wedding celebration. Do we recognize that? Do we recognize with awe the glory of the bridegroom coming down to meet us, coming down to enter into his bride? Are we purified and ready to receive our bridegroom? Are we ready? It's so important to be ready. God through the old covenants, took so much time forming Israel, crafting her to be ready. A second observation here for couples, that the intimacy of the marriage bed, of the conjugal act, of the sexual act, is reserved exclusively to the sacrament of marriage, to the covenant of marriage. The covenant of marriage finds its identity and its purpose and its direction in the covenant of marriage between Christ the bridegroom and his bride, the church. We see that played out most beautifully, and we see its sacredness in the Mass. How profane and obtuse would it be if the altar in a church, which receives the presence of God, if somebody was just to place a cup of chocolate milk on it, or some toast with peanut butter or something like that, we would rightly, and we ought to be appalled by that, because that's just the wrong place for it. How much more so the sexual act outside of the covenant of marriage? It should scandalize us. It doesn't belong there. It doesn't belong there. So here Christ unlocks for us, and St. Paul unlocks for us, the sacredness of marriage and the sacredness of the conjugal act, which finds again its sacredness primarily in the new covenant of Christ the bridegroom and his bride, the church. And finally, that true love finds its direction in subjection out of love for Christ. In his famous work, Karol Wojtyła, who then went on to become the great Pope John Paul the Great, wrote Love and Responsibility. And his main theme of the book is this: to truly love, one must take responsibility for the one he loves. If we really love somebody, think about the people in your life you love, the people in your life you want to love. How do you know you're doing that? When you start to take responsibility for their sanctification, and you make that your habit. So much more to be said there. If there's questions and thoughts, feel free to hammer away in the comment section below. But I'm John Shackle. This has been a missionary moment, and I hope to see you next time.